According to the establishment, and indeed many on his own side, Jeremy Corbyn was a bitter throwback to the failed politics of the 1970s. My guest tonight, Leo Panitch, couldn't disagree more, however, seeing Corbyn's tradition, the Bennite New Left, as a path not taken after the 1970s, as distinct from the post-war Labourist era as it was to New Labour. That's the argument he makes in his new book, Searching for Socialism, the project of the Labour New Left from Benn to Corbyn. Leo, you're coming in from Canada, Toronto. How are you doing?
I am. Good to see you, Aaron.
Good to see you too. How's things? You had a great, highly successful launch of the book, didn't you?
We did. It was phenomenal. There were over 600 people online at any one time, and my joke about that is that if we had the launch on April 18th, as we intended to, at Houseman's in London at the bookshop, it would have been a health hazard if there had been 30 people in that bookshop, even without the pandemic. So it shows you what this type of media can do.
Yeah. And just for our audience out there, it's an exceptional book. I was saying this to Leo before we went live. It's superbly written. We'll obviously be sort of traversing the contents of it, but to make the New Left's birth from 1966 feel so relevant to a context in the 21st century, I think it's partly about the political relevance, but also partly how well you've written it. It's a really, really surprising. When I say surprising, the history of the New Left, it should be a little bit boring. It's not boring whatsoever. One of the best books I've read in a long time, actually. Can I just ask you, what sort of moved you to write this? Because obviously, I can only presume that the intention to write this started well before the demise of the project late last year.
Yeah, it certainly began before that. Well, Colin Lees and I, my co-author, had done a book called The End of Parliamentary Socialism back in 1997, just as Blair got elected. And we told the story there of the emergence of the Labour New Left and its displacement by the center left, the Kinnock-Foot alliance, which paved the way then for the third wave, for New Labour, for Blairism. And I have to tell you, having told that story, since I had always predicted that the Bennite attempt to change the party would fail, while I admired it greatly, I knew it would fail, and it did. And having told that story, trying to show its importance, but then traced its failure, I lost interest in British politics for, some 15 years, if not more. And it was only really when I received a email from a young man called Max Shanley, who you know very well, who had befriended Tony Benn, and I discovered that he had virtually memorized large passages from The End of Parliamentary Socialism, that I thought I should get to know this young generation, the kind of generation that founded Red Labour, the social media predecessor to Novara. And, that tweaked my interest before Corbyn's election. And when Max called me all excited, I was in Athens at the time, to say that Corbyn had been nominated and got enough MPs to nominate him. I said, well, that's all well and good, but he can't win. Well, lo and behold, he did, not least to Red Labour, or the people who founded it. And it was at that point that I said to myself, and convinced Colin as well, that we'd better figure out what exactly happened to produce this, and whether this time around there would be a better chance of turning the Labour Party into a democratic socialist party. So that's really what launched the book, the attempt for ourselves to understand how we got to that point.
And this talk of the New Left, I think for most people who are... do you have a pair of headphones, Leo?
I do, but they're not with me in this room.
Oh, no, because I can hear you, and our audience can basically hear us, well, me talking twice, which they want to probably hear you talking twice rather than me. Do you... Can you explain to our audience why... or maybe that was Gary, because I can't hear you anymore. That's good. You talk about the emergence of the new left coming out of the mid 1960s as something which is quite distinct from the sort of post-war left, so the Bevanite left. Can you sort of just eke that out a little bit? Because most people, when they hear the new left, they think after the 70s, 1980s, sort of Greenham Common. Why are you articulating this new left as coming out of the mid 1960s, which we're told the kind of cliche is that this is the apogee of the industrial proletariat, organized labor, etc.
No, it's very, very mistaken. The 60s generation had an enormous influence on politics everywhere. And it wasn't just a matter of young students and intellectuals. In any case, those young students usually came from working class backgrounds. It was also a matter of young workers who were going out on unofficial strikes, on wildcat strikes, against their union leaders as much against their bosses. There was this decade of insubordination, which was very, very oriented to trying to not only address a series of issues which the left had traditionally marginalized, and it was in that period, of course, that the women's liberation movement emerged, the gay liberation movement emerged, and the tremendous anti-war protests of the Vietnam era. This left was insubordinate in all kinds of ways and was very aware of the way in which the democratic institutions of Western democracy were very undemocratic in their actual practice. And it was that they were getting at. Now, as with the shift from Occupy to Sanders and Corbyn, whereby people who had given up on parties returned to them very quickly after the Occupy moment and launched these remarkable insurgencies inside the Democratic and Labor parties. So it was in the 1960s. In the 1960s, that generation was little interested in parties, especially given the disappointments of the Labor government elected in 64 and re-elected in 66. And that's largely what they were protesting against. But by the 1970s, they began to flow into the parties. They began to realize that their movement activities could only go so far. And indeed, if they wanted to carry them further, they got involved usually first at a community level, at a local level, with their local labor parties. More broadly, they were drawn in by the Bennite insurgency, which articulated the project of the left as, if you really want to democratize the British state, you first have to democratize the Labour Party. And in that way, above all, it was very, very different from the Labour Party that preceded the 1960s, including the great Labour government of 1945, which, while it introduced tremendous reforms, did very little to democratize the state. And indeed, the party was run by that government in conjunction with right-wing union leaders, for the most part, in a highly undemocratic manner. And what was then articulated in the 1970s, therefore, and for people of my generation, I was 25 in 1970, what this reflected was a realization on our parts that the communist parties, capital C communist parties, and the social democratic parties, including the Labour Party in Britain, had really reached their limits as agencies of social transformation. For different reasons, of course, but both of them had. And if we were to put socialism back on the agenda, and we were very aware of the limits that a social democracy, a welfare state had reached by the 1960s, very aware that unless you went past those reforms, you were going to start losing them. And that's what Benn articulated so well as early as 1970. It was clear that we needed a new form of politics. Many of my generation went off to found a better Leninism, usually through new Trotskyist formations. Some went into the old communist parties and tried to found Euro-communism, a democratic communism. Others went into the social democratic parties, including the Labour Party, and tried to democratize them. And of all of those attempts, there was one here in Canada which was expelled by 1971 from the New Democratic Party. There had been an attempt in Germany by the Young Socialists, and they were expelled. Many of those went on to found the Green Party. But the attempt in the Labour Party was the most profound, the most impressive, and it lasted over a decade. The resistance to it was so great from the parliamentarians who were holding on to the elite form of democracy that is the gentleman's club of the House of Commons. And a good chunk of the Labour Party apparatus, the Labour Party machinery, above all the regional organizers, held on to that. And the majority in the PLP, above all, were not socialists by this point. They were career politicians and convinced that capitalism was the best of all possible worlds. Even the guru of social democracy, Anthony Crosland, as late as 1973, said that there was no fundamental crisis in Western capitalism. And you know, they were so blatantly wrong that the left was able to make a run, a very impressive run, through the course of the 1970s, oriented to two things. One was to revive a set of socialist policies, the alternative economic strategy, that would go beyond the social democratic reforms to begin to take capital away from capital, to take the investment decisions, what's to be invested, how it's to be invested, where it's to be invested, into the public domain, into the democratic domain, but also to democratize the party and then to try to democratize the state. With some visions, which the Labour government in 45 had suppressed, of also democratizing industry. The Institute for Workers' Control was very closely aligned with Benn. Benn was very open, as was the whole of the Labour New Left, to the Lucas Aerospace initiative, whereby shop stewards from across a range of unions proposed the conversion of military production to socially useful production. So that was the tenor of the time. And it was repressed. It was defeated by the early 1980s. And that defeat led to the long winter of a socialist left prospect in Britain, all the way to Corbyn's election in 2015.
I mean, at the top of the show, I said this was a very relevant, book, and I think people listening to that can probably begin to understand why. It's a very familiar story to people who've been keeping up to date with the last 5 years in British politics, in particular, to a lesser extent in the United States. Slightly different conversation. Can you talk about Dick Taverne, or Tavern? Maybe you can pronounce his name better, because this was a brilliant kind of vignette. And this is what I think is one of the great sort of profoundly interesting things in this book, is that time after time, you bring up these historical characters or sort of platitudes trotted out by the establishment. They're 30, 40 years old, and I've heard them for weeks, months on end just recently, which really does tell you nothing changes. Who is Dick Taverne, and why does he matter?
Well, Dick Taverne was really the figure that launched inadvertently the whole reselection of MPs movement in the Labour Party. He had been part of the Atlanticist right-wing group in the party, which, together with people like Dennis Healy, look very much like the machine people that you just were exposed to in the leaked report on anti-Semitism. They, from the early 60s on, had done everything that they possibly could to ensure that socialists, that left-wingers, that people who were in favor of nuclear disarmament, that people who wanted to take their distance from the American empire would not get nominated as Labour Party candidates. they could have taught the Stalinists 2 or 3 things in terms of how to operate a political machine undemocratically and in a sectarian, factionalized fashion. Well, and Taverne was an Atlanticist of the first order, and he was most concerned when Britain entered the common market that the Labour Party would not support this. And indeed, the party was divided. The Labour Party wanted him to represent the majority view in that constituency, which was against the European Union. And one has to say that insofar as one was concerned with going beyond capital, because that was on the agenda by then, given the disappointments with the 1960s Labour government. You know, the first IMF impositions on Britain were not in the mid-70s, but in the mid-60s. Labour was introducing wage restraint and wage controls on unions, not in the mid-70s. They were then too, but in the mid-60s. Wilson, while not sending troops to Vietnam, was certainly not critical of American policy in Vietnam, etc. So, you know, people in his constituency party understood that embedded in the Treaty of Rome, going back to 1958, was the long-term goal of doing away with capital controls, was the free movement of capital. That was only finally realized, of course, not until Economic and Monetary Union in the 1980s. But that was the agenda. So they were, fish and chips nationalism. It wasn't because when they went down, and I don't know whether I've lost you guys.
We've got you. You're coming in and
Good,
out.
I'm back.
Hopefully we can. This is just a yeah.
Are we okay now?
We're okay now. Capital controls. Dictator.
Hello.
Yeah,
we're okay now. Okay, so they wanted him to represent their view, and he absolutely refused. So they then said that they were going to try to nominate a new MP, which I must tell you, most parties in the world, let alone social democratic ones, liberal ones, do every election. Just the fact that you're an MP doesn't mean you don't have to get renominated again. In the British aristocratic parliament, that is seen as a revolutionary thing. And this led to a massive dust-up led by Taverne. And it was on that basis that the reselection of MPs became the central issue for the campaign for Labour Party democracy. Of course, it was also, which developed in 1973, and it was also concerned with the fact that Wilson and then Callaghan, who succeeded him as leader, made it so explicitly clear that the socialist policies passed at the party conference on the advice of the National Executive, which had moved to the left in the 1970s with the support of the unions and led the left union leadership and led by Benn, had produced a series of radical proposals for planning agreements with the big corporations and beyond that for democratizing the state. And Wilson had made it clear that he wasn't going to adopt this. There had been talk of nationalizing the top 25 companies. Wilson was adamant that he wouldn't have anything to do with this. So it was also a matter of democratizing the party in the terms of expecting, since it was constitutionally the case that the party conference is sovereign, that the parliamentary leadership would follow the same priorities. So it was both the democratization question, which came to a head around, do we have the right to renominate MPs, given we could run Mickey Mouse, where Taverne was elected and get him elected. And also the question of whether the party leadership would abide by the NEC's and the conference's policy decisions.
The way I saw Dick Taverne was kind of like he was the Change UK Mark I.
Yes, he was exactly that. And it's so interesting that that it had to do with Europe at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. So
You
he's
know, it
like,
was also the people's vote. Yeah,
yeah, so it's
exactly.
kind of like the exact same social forces, social configuration. He even joins the Liberal
Absolutely.
Democrats. And you just think,
Absolutely.
Christ, we've been stuck in this historical moment for like 40 years. Well, actually,
We
50
have
years.
indeed, and it's because that Labor New Left was defeated. You know, when the Bennites spoke so derisively of the old left, they were lumping the new left we've been talking about with an old left, the left of Ernest Bevin, the left of Morrisonian public corporations, who are run by experts or people with high status who don't have any expertise and have no industrial democracy within them. That was the old left, right? And it even included, to some extent, the old Tribunite left. Insofar as, yes, they were interested in nuclear disarmament and distancing themselves from the American empire, in more nationalization, but were utter parliamentarians. For them, democracy began and ended with labor representation in parliament. Any broader conception of democratization was beyond their ken. So calling the new left the part of the old left was a tremendous distortion. And I think that hid away from a great many people for a very long time. And the book is trying to uncover this. The extent to which the Labor New Left was not the old left. And indeed, a good part of New Labor actually reflected and resembled people like Dick Taverne, who, yes, rejected the Tribunite interest in a more independent British foreign policy and the Tribunite interest in more nationalization, but were like them and even more oriented to a fundamentally undemocratic party and undemocratic state. In that sense, it was the Blairites who were more similar to old Labor than anything else.
And often when people talk about, the old left and, sort of the sort of antecedent to Jeremy Corbyn being Michael Foot, 1983, longest suicide note in history. What I think you do really, really well in the book is to actually say Michael Foot and the sort of political trajectory, the intellectual tradition, the political tradition he comes out of is very, very different to Jeremy Corbyn. It's very different to Jeremy Corbyn. And also, what I never even thought of this before. He was selected as the party's leader by the PLP. So the idea that somehow, the revisionism that goes on here, which says, oh, we shouldn't empower members because they naturally will, select politicians like Michael Foot. Well, Michael Foot was selected by Labour MPs. Go figure. Why should we not think of Michael Foot as a sort of Jeremy Corbyn 1.0? What are the differences there in their politics?
Well, look, Foot was a very admirable figure. He was an amazing orator in the House of Commons. His only equal was Enoch Powell on the right. You listen to Labour Party politicians of every stripe, I must say, today and compare them with the erudition of a Michael Foot, and it's just appalling. He was a committed working class representative. He represented the Clyde in South Wales, and was a committed anti-imperialist, constantly being watched by the MI5 to make sure that he wasn't meeting with any Soviets, since anybody who was against Atlanticism and opposed to the Cold War was suspect as being a Soviet spy. All those things that need to be said about Michael Foot. That said, while he was the link and buckle with the trade unions during the 1960s and 1970s, between the labor left and the unions, he was above all concerned with party unity. And when the recriminations were visited upon the labor leadership for the policies of the Labor government, the Wilson government of the 1960s, he aligned himself very strongly with the center right. That is, Healy in particular, but to some extent Jenkins and so on, those people who had determined those policies under the Wilson government. He did not want a break in the party. So he was constantly concerned with building a bridge between the left-wing leadership and the leadership of the Labour Party. And he was not interested in the type of democratization proposals that were coming out of the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy. In fact, he probably thought that they were anti-parliamentary. And, you know, what happened in the context of even the greater disappointment with the Callaghan government, Callaghan coming to the Labour Party conference in 1976 and saying the Keynesian moment was over, the commitment to full employment was over. He was, of course, speaking to the Labour Party members, but he was speaking over their heads to the IMF and to the Treasury in Washington, so they'd give Labour a loan. Foote did not support Benn's alternative economic strategy, which he constantly brought to cabinet, which involved capital and import controls and introduction of planning agreements. The only person who supported him very, very briefly was Crossland in the cabinet meetings. And then, you know, after the, you know, appalling outcome of that government with the defeat in 1979 to Thatcher, Callaghan stepped down deliberately, just as the Labour Party broadened the basis of electing a Labour Party leader, saying there was a special conference and they created the electoral college, whereby the unions would have a third of the vote, the constituency parties would have a third of the vote, and the PLP would have a third of the vote. And Callaghan called a leadership election step down before that came into place. And that was deliberately designed to avoid Benn becoming leader, as he would have done. And Foote was elected leader on the basis of what we call in the book the Foote-Healy Alliance, which Kinnock joined, having been with Dennis Skinner, the hero at Labour Party conferences, at fringe meetings, at Tribune meetings, etc., supporting the demands of the Labour left. And that led to this division of a very stark kind before the 1983 election between the Foote-Healy axis and those who wanted to continue to democratize the party, the Bennites at the national level, and at the local level, the people who produced the Livingston-led changes in the Greater London Council. And it was that division, with the people on the right quite prepared to leak, as I say, into the public urinal against what they constantly called to journalists the loony left, to oppose the selection of a socialist gay candidate in South London on homophobic as well as anti-socialist grounds, with Foote moving quickly to try to expel him and then losing the ability to do that when it was clear the ugliness of the reasons for this. And on the eve of the election, you know, really the days before it, although Foote had retained the commitment to do away with Britain's nuclear deterrent, which had been so dear to his heart his whole life, in the 1983 manifesto, Healy stabbed him in the back and went to the press and said, "I will not abide by doing away with Britain's nuclear deterrent." So the divisions, the right never took responsibility for the unity of the party on its own shoulders. The old Labour left did. And when it came to an election, the new left in the Labour Party did. The right has always been more loyal to their loyalty to the American Empire, which is how they understand holding on to Trident, than to anything else. Taverne represented that. Healy represented that. And I believe around the issue of the common market, around the issue of staying in the EU, for those who were most adamantly interested in staying and did everything possible to embarrass Corbyn around this, made his situation impossible. It was because they see Europe as part of the informal American empire. That was what was really driving them above all.
The Peter Tatchell thing is really important. I think it's not really discussed enough. You know what happened with regards to Southwark. Again, it was a similar thing going on there. There was not a deselection of an MP, but there was, I think was he no confidence by the local CLP, and then this became a major story. The Sun gets involved. The Sun was claiming that Peter Tatchell had attended. At this point, he wasn't out. They said he'd attended the Gay Olympics, and this was put to Foot, and Foot had to disown him. It's a remarkable episode. Often when people say, "Oh, Labour's been at the forefront of fighting against homophobia," not always. There wasn't a full-throated defence from the party leadership then of Peter Tatchell.
No, and
far from it.
Far from it, and he was done in because he was seen to be a supporter of the Labour New Left. By that point, Benn had lost by the narrowest of margins the deputy leadership election after Foot was elected, which was done on the basis of the new electoral college. And a reaction had set in the National Executive Committee. The left-wing union leadership, which had supported very radical resolutions at party conference, were not so enthusiastic about the democratic reforms. They listened to Foot on the need to unify the party after the defeat in '79. That was the main priority. And therefore, they began to adhere to the Foot-Healey axis. I must say there was more to that. It was also the case that militant industrial workers by the late 1970s had grown fearful in the face of unemployment. And they, moreover, were resentful of the continuing militancy of public sector workers, from nurses to garbage men to refuse collectors. So when the strikes occurred in 1978-79, mostly public sector strikes, what was known as the Winter of Discontent, there was a great deal of division inside the working class between industrial workers and public sector workers. So some of the left union leaders moved to the right. That happened in the engineering union above all. In the case of the transport and general workers, the predecessor of Unite, it was more a matter of Jack Jones aligning with Michael Foot for the sake of the unity of the party. In that context, the union leaders on the NEC aligned with the very right-wing elements on the NEC. And they took over the national executive against the Bennites, and who were largely elected from the constituency party. And then the constituencies would elect left-wing MPs onto the NEC. So they'd lost control of the party. It had never gone so far, the changes in the party, as to root out the regional organizers, whose main talent since the 50s had been to expel people. That was their main talent. That's what they were good at. And you saw that again in 2015, 2016, when so many people joined the party. These people were mainly worried. They were now Blairites, of course. The same old ones weren't there. They had passed away and been replaced by Blairites. But they had the same skills. And those skills were oriented to making sure that nobody who came into the party would be a bloody left-winger. Would be, pardon the expression, a shit disturber. So that was their attitude to the vast influx in membership. Are we back?
You were fine. There's going to be. Hello? You went out for 5-10 seconds. It's fine. No, you're here. Carry on. Okay, you came in saying shit disturber. We lost you when you were talking about regional organisers. You came back in saying shit disturber. So I think it's a pretty coherent narrative arc to our audience.
Well, and they didn't want shit disturbers. Yeah.
So
in the run up to the '83 election, when someone like Tatchell
Oh, we've lost Leo.
Though I can't see you. There we go.
Oh, no.
Hi.
I'll tell you
I
what.
think we're back.
Yeah, we are back. What we might do, Leo, is if you can, Gary can maybe get you to lower the resolution of the of your input, because I think the problem is your upload speed. You see us fine, so your download is probably okay, but the upload might not be so good.
I did it once before, so I'll now put it on low definition.
Super low.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope this works. Sorry about this.
That's fine. 90% of it's
good.
Fine. We've caught. I mean, the important stuff is the Dick Taverne stuff, the Michael Foot stuff, the Tribune stuff. A similar question is: you cite a book in this book, and actually, I only read this book you've cited maybe 2 months ago, "Thinking the Unthinkable," which is a history of sort of Thatcherism and the ecology of think tanks and intellectuals around it from the early 1950s, actually, all the way through to 1979 with the Centre for Policy Studies and so on. And having read that book before, and it's very much recommended. I think Richard Cockett is his name. I think brilliant book, and it's quite clear that by the early to mid 70s, people like Keith Joseph, to a lesser extent Margaret Thatcher, but she's still there, have a diagnosis of the Keynesian kind of consensus just falling apart, and they're fully aware of that. And you get a similar impression with Tony Benn from 1970 onwards. So is it fair to say that what ties Keith Joseph, Anthony Fisher, I think from the IEA, later Margaret Thatcher, what ties them to Tony Benn is an understanding that the old consensus was going. And what I find really interesting is, again, the analogy to the present day. So people say, well, Corbyn didn't have the backing of the party. He never could have won. But the reality is Margaret Thatcher only ever had one supporter in her shadow cabinet, which preceded her, rather, which was Keith Joseph, right? She encountered very similar structural obstacles, but once she won the leadership election, actually the Tory party more or less got behind her, far more than Labour got behind Jeremy Corbyn. Do you think when the consensus breaks down, whether it's after 1929, whether it's after the 1970s, whether it's after 2008, do you think the Tories have a comparative advantage in so much as their people aren't as ideologically committed to the sort of status quo ante, and so they can actually respond to new conditions much better, and that's generally speaking why they win?
Well, we address this in the book. I think that's basically it, but you need to remember that if one uses the metaphor of breaking the mold of British politics, which a lot of people were doing in the 70s and 80s, the new Social Democrats, those who left with the Gang of Four, the Labour Party in the early 80s, in which Taverne joined, they took that as their slogan, but they were least concerned with breaking the mold. They were trying to keep the old form. As you say, the Bennites and the Thatcherites were really breaking the mold. But if you're trying to break the mold as a Thatcherite, yes, you're breaking the mold of the Keynesian consensus, and you're moving towards a state which would be not a small state, but a state which would be facilitating market behavior in every arena of human life, would be in the socialist case, in the Bennite case, in the case of Labour New Left, you're taking on much more than that. Sure, you're taking on the limits of Keynesianism. You're recognizing that the welfare state has now reached the point, if it's going to continue, that it needs to start going beyond capital, or you're going to lose those reforms because of the contradictions it's produced by way of inflation, wage conflict under conditions of full employment, when young workers feel so confident, etc. Right? But you're not just taking on the policy stuff. In order to introduce those new policies, you need to look at politics in an entirely different way. You need to be seeing politics as the education of the masses, so that they will support these very radical policies when opposition comes from the capitalist class, from the
We were getting into the real meat. We were getting into the real meat. Yeah, we're still here. We were getting into
from the bureaucratic establishment, above all from the mainstream media. It means you're also taking on.
Oh.
Sorry about this.
That's
I'm
fine,
sure
Leo.
it's my side, and I got a little thing.
No, it's fine. Leo, maybe we could just go to audio. Maybe that might be the best thing.
If you like.
Is that okay, Gary?
You want to try that?
Let me see what Gary says. I think that'd be wise. I mean, because then it'd be. I think there's just we can finish on the stuff about Blair. Should we try that?
Shall I hit mute?
Not mute. We want to get rid of the video, so you need to disable the cam. If you see a little cam mic, and then next to that stop cam.
Yes. Stop cam. Okay.
Let's try this.
All right.
How's that?
Good.
We should have done.
Anyway,
can I just say, Leo, the book is really brilliant. The book is absolutely brilliant, and people really should read it. And the sort of the segments you're talking about, the stuff about political education and so on. You came on and spoke about it with Navarro Media, but how you situate the necessity of doing that within a historic political context, very important. Sorry, carry on.
Well, I just would say about that. One of the things I think that the Labour New Left did not put on its agenda, that Thatcher did, and that the Blairites did, was to educate members of Parliament from their perspective. They saw the important thing as providing political education at the base, and that was certainly very necessary. But the way in which Thatcher forced Tory MPs to swallow Hayekian economics, to read the pamphlets of the Adam Smith Society, etc. And the way the Blairites not only made sure that left-wingers weren't getting nominated to be candidates at the constituency level, but also engaged in the propaganda campaign of New Labour ideology, of third wayist ideology, getting them all to read Anthony Giddens and all of that superficial stuff on globalization with capital bypassing states, et cetera, et cetera. They had a task because they saw, of course, the parliamentary game as the real game, and weren't interested for once they got the vote. They don't care about what the masses think, so long as they get the vote. So they were much more engaged in turning the MPs into supporters, ideologically committed supporters of their view. They didn't always succeed, of course. I don't think Labour took that on. I think New Labour under Corbyn, to some extent under Benn, maybe rightly realized that these are career politicians, that their main reference groups are the Westminster media lobby, and there'd be no chance of turning them into socialists. But it's my view that MPs, when they first get nominated, are largely unformed ideologically. And if you're going to make them accountable to the activists in the party, the majority of the party, who I do think are instinctively socialist and would be very enthused, I think, by a socialist education campaign. If you're going to make them really accountable to them, you have to be engaged in educating the people who get nominations as Labour MPs as well.
Are there any organizations around the world where the left can sort of take inspiration in that respect? Because I think we've had it in the comments section. It was one of the sort of outstanding failures of the Corbyn era, was not to provide that. I mean, you could probably blame, I wouldn't want to blame anybody, but you could say Momentum could have done that. Maybe Unite could have done that. The party could have done that, given that the left had control of the political levers of it really since late 2017, early 2018. How would you advise the left going forward to kind of implement those kinds of shifts to a higher level of sort of political education amongst the party membership? Because something I've seen a lot recently, I saw on Twitter, and this is not attacking anybody who said it, younger activists, because obviously there's been a failure with the Corbyn project, and that's indisputable, they say, well, this can't work, the left can't work, we should just basically try and get something slightly to the left of Tony Blair. How do you think that the organised left, whether it's the Socialist Campaign Group, whether it's Momentum, Unite, left-wing CLPs, how can they counter that? How can they begin to build more effective political education in the here and now?
This is the main message of the book, in fact. And insofar as we are critical of the Corbyn leadership and of Momentum, it is that it didn't go far enough in this direction. In that sense, I must say, the outcome, given the way the leadership got trapped in the Westminster bubble, after the success of the 2017 election, denying May a majority, and therefore Corbyn had to spend so much time at what he was not very good at, speaking in Parliament, and the leadership got trapped in it. Attention got turned away from the need for political education. And that's true of Momentum as well, which is a very impressive organization, but became far too much oriented, and maybe they had to in order to be as successful as they were, towards being a campaigning organization for first Corbyn's re-election as leader, and then for the Labour Party's election under Corbyn's leadership, which they did very well. But much more than that was needed. Now, to be fair, the World Transformed started to do this. And, those of you who aren't as long in the tooth as I am and as gray in the hair won't be able to realize what a revolution the World Transformed brought to Labour Party conferences, even if one goes back and compares them to the 1970s. That cultural and intellectual set of meetings that the World Transformed ran at Labour Party conferences, and I hope will run at future ones, from 2016 on, was nothing that the Labour Party had ever seen in its whole history. And there were some people in the World Transformed and Momentum who saw the need to keep this going at a local level between conferences, but not nearly enough, and not enough resources were put into it. This is crucial now, absolutely crucial. This, I think, does have to become central to the agenda. And look, insofar as it must be the case that a great many of the people who joined enthused by Corbyn voted for Starmer rather than Rebecca Long Bailey, whatever the criticisms you want to make, that while people were enthused by their ability to really map what needs to be done must be considered fairly limited, because Starmer, who has never shown any interest in the type of democratization of a fundamental kind, either of the party or of the state apparatus we're talking about, and above all, was, after all, the conduit of the people's vote demand, not only that Labour sign on to a second referendum, but that Corbyn, even before that referendum and before the election, say that he was going to give the finger to those working class voters who had voted the way they did in the referendum. And however, it might have turned out just as badly on the other side had Corbyn not opted for the second referendum. But either way, we know what the outcome was, and this outcome, as we know, was a disaster. And what's going to have to be rebuilt is the type of working class community that has a link to constituency parties in traditional working class areas, as well as in the areas of the new working class, where debate and discussion and the ability to have some confidence, the way so many people who speak on Navarro do, to be able to assess the nature of the society they live in and ways to go forward. So few working people feel confident about that. And it's the task of a democratic socialist party, not just to be putting forward policies, but to be developing the capacities of the people that they organize and mobilize and represent.
And in terms of Starmer, what's your structure analysis of him? Where's your read on him? I mean, you've said why you think he's taken the party a certain way. Why people who had perhaps joined the party to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, it's quite inarguable. Many of them chose him over her. But if you were to sort of put your money down on the table now, make that bet, what do you think the future of the Labour Party is under him? Could he potentially win a general election in a manner akin to, say, Francois Hollande in France in, I think, 2012? Could he do that? Or do you think that the structural barriers to even that genre of social democracy with Thatcherism, with neoliberalism in this country, they are so strong that he simply has no chance? I'm interested in your read on this. Is it possible he could win if there was some kind of alliance between himself, the soft left of the Labour Party, and this new left? Or do you think that's just wholly impossible?
No, I think he could win. I must say he's about as charismatic as Francois Hollande, which is not charismatic at all, and Hollande won. So yeah, given the what may happen on the right, what may happen with this government, the incredible irrational contradictions of contemporary 21st century capitalism everywhere, which the pandemic is exposing all the more. The Boris Johnson type of superficial politics may indeed be increasingly in trouble. Who knows? It's not impossible that Starmer could win. What is unfortunately the case, that because of the contradictions of this irrational system are so blatantly before us, what is the case is that without a radical strategy, without a commitment to that strategy, without a strategy for building mass popular understanding and support of that strategy, the government, as turned out with Hollande, will be utterly conventional. And if it's utterly conventional, it'll be overwhelmed by the contradictions again. And this has been the case with the Labour Party for over 50 years. The story we are telling, nobody can be excited about the Labour Party, even if they're just center left, from 1965 on. The disappointments of the 60s and 70s governments, the long period in opposition through Thatcherism in the 80s, and Blair not getting elected until 97, and then the massive disappointment with New Labour, both because of its market-oriented content in terms of policy, but also because of its support for the American empire militarily in the Iraq War. And then the explosion in the crisis of 2008 of the whole strategy. Who gets excited about this? So the story of the Labour Party since 65 was a story of no excitement. Ed Miliband's break with New Labour did bring 50,000 people into the party, but Ed's commitment to maintaining unity with a parliamentary party that was overwhelmingly Blairite or Brownite meant that he couldn't do much to keep that enthusiasm going. It was only with Corbyn's emergence that you got, for the first time since 1965, a sense of excitement about the Labour Party, to such an extent that it suddenly became the largest mass party in Europe. Unimaginable. And that was something of great importance. I never thought it was going to be easy. I'm not surprised that one can say that the Corbyn project failed with the 2019 election. But I have to say, one has to give it enormous credit for coming so close in the 2017 election. And it leaves a legacy. And in that sense, it's not a failure. It leaves the legacy of Novara Media. It leaves the legacy of momentum. It leaves the legacy of the world transformed. This is an institutional legacy of an enormously important kind. And people have to take that legacy and work with it and develop the capacity so that next time around, when you will be electing someone young who will represent these ideas and take them further, rather than someone who was himself rooted in the 70s, as Corbyn was, or MacDonald was, or Trickett was. They passed it over now to you in the younger generation. And it's your responsibility now to make sure that the next time you get this chance, you need to carry it through. Now, I must say that may involve not taking the unity of the party on your shoulders, as Corbyn did around the Brexit issue. It may have to involve taking the risk that the Labour right will leave. They will never stay in a socialist party, but they always use their threat of leaving, as the people who left as independents a year ago in early 2019. They will use the threat of leaving as a way of saying, well, you can't get elected as a divided party, which was what happened in 1983. And at some point, the left is going to have to take a deep breath, try to convince the left union leadership to stay with them. In that sense, continue to control the party machinery, and then turn that party machinery and the union machinery into active agencies of working class education and community engagement. That's what would need to happen if the Labour Party ever really was to become a vehicle for socialist advance, which it still is not.
Can I ask you one final question, then we'll try and bring you back in for video to say goodbye. It was an interesting point you make in the book, which is the compass left often tries to paint the Bennite left as being sort of dictatorial, top down, hierarchical. And you think this is a kind of almost a Blairite sleight of hand, which isn't to say they are Blairites, but they've swallowed whole a certain myth of the new left. Do you think there's a danger that's going to happen moving forward, that a lot of people are clearly going to be radicalized, not just by Corbynism, but by Brexit, by a mode of production which is obviously in free fall since 2008, more recently coronavirus? Do you think there's a very real chance that, again, that soft left would actively seek to misrepresent the radical left as something that it isn't? And how do you propose that you bridge that problem, or overcome that problem, surmount that problem? How do you propose to build an alliance between the soft left and between the slightly more radical left against the right?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on something that is most likely. I think instinctively the center-left MPs did adopt that view, and the younger people who hadn't been around in the 1970s to actually see the difference between the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, or the Bennite left, and militant, accepted the Blairite misrepresentation of history, which drew no distinction between sectarian factionalism on the far left and the really liberal orientation, if anything, of the democratic socialist left around Benn. It was an appallingly unfair charge. I do think that the campaign left the Tribune group of MPs around the split with Foote, that their isolation was such in the Kinnock years and the Blairite years that they did draw the wagons around themselves to some extent. And they didn't reach out far enough to win allies, even amongst parliamentarians who might have been won over in the first decade of the century, and then again in the second decade of the 21st century, even under Corbyn's leadership. Some were better at it than others, but I don't think they knew how to do that very well. It's something that goes back to what I was saying about needing to educate parliamentarians as well. So, yeah, I fear that a great many people may adopt this view. The response to the visible factionalism, the appalling intolerance of those people in the party machine that were exposed. Sorry.
That's all right.
That were exposed in the leaked report. You can see what bullies and how sectarian that right can be. But the response to it from the Starmers, and I think Starmer said explicitly, was we have to do away with factionalism in the Labour Party. And it's just so unfair. And people have got to learn to rise above this, to have confidence in themselves as being what I think all of the young people I've met at the World Transformed are, which is far from being narrow sectarians of the old militant variety. They are open-minded democratic socialists of a kind that I haven't seen for a very, very long time. Now, some people may say, actually, they need to be more ruthless in confronting the right, given how ruthless the right is. And there's something to that, perhaps. But I fear you're right, Aaron. I fear that people will be open to that type of caricature. And I very much think that it's the responsibility of Novera to show, as I think it does show in its content every day, that that's not the case.
Well, that's very kind of you to say, Leo. Do you think you could switch your camera back on and we'll say farewell?
Sure.
Yeah. There you go. This is the book. It's brilliant. Oh, Searching for Socialism. It is excellent. I think at the moment it's on sale at Verso. I think it's $7.50 plus the ebook. I think it's reduced.
It's at 50% off.
Yeah. So people should go buy that book if you can right now. Make it a gift. I always think socialist gifts are brilliant propaganda. Leo will hopefully speak again soon, hopefully under better circumstances.
I hope I look forward to it. And maybe I'll be able to do it again in the Novera studio.
Fingers crossed.
I must say, Aaron, if you give me another minute.
Go on.
I was in there in November for an interview with Zarb Cousins and Shanley for their show. And I was down. I could see that people at the party conference in September, and then as the campaign began, if you don't mind me saying this, I've used the word shit, I might as well use the other one, we're pissing in the wind. That they felt that the outcome that occurred in December was going to come. And of course, they had to be motivated to keep going. And I opened my remarks in response to a question that I was asked by trying to raise what was about to happen. And they didn't run that interview. Understandably, they didn't run that interview because they didn't want to bring people down. The campaign was just beginning, and they had to have people motivated, and they didn't want to hear this old Canadian socialist fart telling them that it was a lost cause, which I felt it was. I had gone canvassing with Ed Miliband up in Yorkshire and South Yorkshire and seen what was going to happen. So I think it's going to be very important that Novera and Momentum not just be cheerleaders, that they provide people with the basis of taking their own measure of where things are at, being sober analysts on their own. And if I'd give you any message, if you don't mind, that would be it.
Well, that's a very important message. I think anybody that's familiar with our content in recent weeks wouldn't be worried about us being cheerleaders for Keir Starmer. We'll absolutely try to pursue a democratic socialist line at all times. Leo, thank you very much. We'll see you soon. Maybe we've lost him. Great book. Hopefully we can get him back on again soon. My name is Aaron Bastani. Really enjoyed tonight's show. Michael Walker is back tomorrow, I believe, with Ash Sarkar, and he's back on Friday as well. Big guest coming then. But tune in. If you've not hit subscribe already, please do, and you'll see Michael's handsome face tomorrow night. Good night.